Hello to everyone who has joined us. Thank you so much for making it to this webinar. And thank you to our two brilliant panelists for making the time for this event. So for this discussion, the South African Jews for a Free Palestine, SAJFP, are hosting our two authors, Jeff Halper and Greenstein, on their most recent books, which will be introduced soon. Faced with the incredible danger that Israel is en route to further enshrining Jewish supremacy and brutally dispossessing Palestinians, the progressive Israeli and diaspora jury feel a heightened degree of responsibility for halting or reversing this reality, or helping to do so. At this crucial moment of opportunity, these books and this kind of webinar offer chances to expand the contemporary conversation on Israel-Palestine and to broaden our political imagination at a time when equitable alternatives are very hard to imagine. So the way that this will work is that I'll introduce the authors and then ask them some questions about their books, the current reality and the future. They will also have a chance to respond to each other as they wish. I'll thereafter that opens the audience for questions. Please feel free to pop questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll try to address as many as possible. We are also recording this event, so we'll share the recording afterwards for those who can't make tonight. And on a technical front, just if we experience load shedding at any point, hopefully we've got people on standby who will then jump in from SAJFP, so not to worry on that. Okay, so Greenstein is a research associate in the School of Social Sciences at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Among his publications are Zionism and Its Discontents, A Century of Radical Dissent in Israel-Palestine, and Anti-Colonial Resistance in South Africa and Israel-Palestine, Identity, Nationalism, and Race. Jeff Halper is an Israeli anthropologist, the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, ICAHD, and a founding member of the One Democratic State campaign. He is the author of numerous books, including Obstacles to Peace, ICAHD's Manual for Activism in Palestine, Israel, and War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification, which was shortlisted for the Palestine Book Award. His latest book is Decolonising Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. Jeff resides in Jerusalem and can be reached at jeffhalper@gmail.com. Okay, we're going to jump into the questions right away, and I'll start with you, Jeff. In your book, you argue that Israel-Palestine must be understood as archetypal settler colonialism before recognizing that the only logical and ideal next step is decolonization. Would you therefore like to please explain the key characteristics that indeed make it a settler colonial project?
Okay, well, thank you, Maya, and thank you to the SAJFP for inviting me. And thanks to Ron also for agreeing to participate. ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions that I run for the last 25 years, actually, has always been a political organization. We do resistance. We resist the demolition of Palestinian homes. We rebuild homes that have been demolished. We work closely with Palestinians. But for us, the house demolition issue was always a vehicle for pushing forward a political agenda, getting people to understand what's happening on the ground, where Israel is going, and what we can do about it. so that we've always been really concerned about we've always been task-oriented. In other words, the idea is, okay, we're resisting, we're protesting, things are happening, people are writing articles, there's BDS, there's conferences, everything else. But where are we going? In a way, you could even ask, so what? And so, we were very involved with the two-state idea 30, 40 years ago, not because we really accepted it, but because the PLO had accepted it. We're not going to be more Catholic than the Pope. But it's been clear over the years that isn't only dead, the two-state solution, it never was. And what's become clear, it's interesting, the whole issue of settler colonialism, Zionism and settler colonialism, has really been around in the academic world for probably the last 20 years. As a matter of fact, there was even 40, 50 years ago, people talking about that. But the academic world, and Ron can testify to this, is very rarefied It takes a long time for ideas to trickle out of the academic realm into the public discourse. And it's only been in the last, I would say, 10 years, maybe, that the whole idea, the analysis of settler colonialism, Zionism and settler colonialism has really emerged into the public debate and into the political analysis and beginning to trickle into political activities. And it's very important because it opens a whole different way of looking at this. It gets us out of the box of two-state and of conflict. And I guess one of the points I want to make that's really important is that it also helps us to change a vocabulary to an anti-colonial vocabulary, actually. One of the key points is we're not in a conflict. You know, we keep talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict all the time. But if you misanalyze a political phenomenon, you can't possibly get to an understanding and to some kind of a solution that's going to work. The solution has to flow out of the analysis. So if your analysis is wrong, then you're really in, and that's been our problem and the problem of governments for the last 50 years, if not 70 years, if not more. And that is seeing this as a conflict. If you think about it, means there's two sides. You can't have a conflict without two sides. Well, immediately you're creating a symmetry. Now, and not only a symmetry, but you're legitimizing the settler colonial side. Now, if there's two sides, that leads you to an idea of conflict resolution, how to resolve a conflict. You get the two sides to sit down and negotiate and compromise and become some kind of a deal. But settler colonialism is unilateral. There aren't two sides. I mean, you just heard yesterday, Bezalel Smotrich, our finance minister, who also runs a civil administration in the West Bank, say there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. Zionism, until this minute, has never recognized the existence of a Palestinian people. So the whole story of Zionism is a self-contained, closed story of us and how we're coming to our historic land, we're returning. And of course, every settler colonial movement makes up a narrative about why the settlers are entitled to the land and not the indigenous population. And we have, of course, the Bible, which is kind of a ready-made narrative for us. and so we have to understand that unlike a conflict, this is unilateral. Zionism comes in with its own agenda. It doesn't care about Palestinians or Arabs, as we call them, because we deny the nationalism until today of Palestinians. They're not a factor. They're not a side. Zionism never thought of negotiating with them in any way, and it never has. Until today, we don't recognize Palestinians as a national group, and therefore it's not a conflict. And the conflict idea is unfair to the indigenous as well, because if you're legitimizing the colonial invaders, and how can you possibly politically legitimize colonial invasion, then what are you really expecting the indigenous population to compromise on? I mean, if they're supposed to sit down and negotiate around the table, negotiate about what? About their indigeneity, about their tie to the land, about the lands they lost, about how many refugees are allowed to return by the colonists, you know, by their very erasure from history, their presence from the country. What exactly are we expecting the indigenous population to negotiate on? So settler colonialism changes that whole paradigm. And it basically says no, there is no resolution. There's no conflict resolution because it's not a conflict. The only way you decolonize, in South Africa, you understand this better than most people, is the only way you end a settler colonial enterprise is by decolonization. You dismantle the structures of control and domination that exist. And that already gives you another agenda rather than negotiations. How do we summon the power to do that? That's another question we have to ask the Palestinians and those that support them. And then, of course, where does that lead? Well, it doesn't lead, decolonization doesn't lead to a two-state solution, obviously. Decolonization leads to one state, one unitary state, even if it contains two or more national groups or ethnic groups or religious groups and others, nonetheless, the idea is that you have to create an inclusive civil political community that actually gives rise to a new civil identity in the state, within which then the two nationalisms, Palestinian nationalism and Israeli Jewish nationalism, can coexist, but the civil state has to control them. So what I'm saying in short is that the whole analysis of settler colonialism is really important in terms of opening up all new possibilities of resolving this. And one more thing I'll say about settler colonialism that's important, and that is, and you know this well in South Africa, in settler colonialism, the settlers stay. So the Palestinian, this is kind of hard for the Palestinians to accept as well, because their concept of liberation, yet the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, was total liberation in the classic, colonial sense. But in settler colonialism, the settlers remain. There's never been a case, as far as I know, in which the indigenous population has driven the settlers out of the country. Even in Algeria, where they fled, they were not driven out by the FLN. And so that's, now how do you do that? How do you reconcile the nationalism and the desire for self-determination in the same country among two competing and hostile national movements, but at the same time create a civic sort of a framework in which that's inclusive, in which everyone can live together? So settler colonialism really sets out for us a really interesting agenda, analysis, and way to move forward.
Thank you so much. It definitely helps to have this framework within which to understand the situation. We'll come back to a lot of the points that you've raised. I'm just going to step to Ran at this point, and just say, I have, thanks to your book as well, become somewhat dissatisfied with the conversations around Israel Palestine that utilize South Africa as a starting point, kind of only for apartheid and boycott related references. In this regard, much work has been done, of course, in comparing apartheid Israel to apartheid South Africa. And as you have expressed, apartheid is indeed a vital concept for understanding Israeli control. But less work has been invested in addressing how South Africa can help shape our strategy for an understanding of resistance politics. And this is something you have invested much time in, especially through your recent book. So why should we delve specifically into the histories of organizing and resistance in these two societies, and what benefits or lessons does it offer us?
Well, you're asking Ron, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, fine.
Okay, thanks. I think my main purpose for writing the book is not actually to derive lessons from South Africa that would be applicable to Palestine. There is value in the study of South Africa itself. And so for me, it's important to go back to issues that are and have been part of the South African debate, political debate, historical debate, theoretical debate, and academic debates as well, and to examine these debates from the perspective of activists and intellectuals who were working together with liberation movements, both nationalist liberation movements and left-wing political movement, communist parties in particular, and to examine the relevance of issues such as race and class, resistance and settlement, domination and opposition, both in the context of South Africa and in the context of Israel-Palestine, both in order to understand these societies on their own terms, but also the comparative study allows us to highlight things that may remain obscure if we study each country in isolation. So the purpose here, from my perspective at least, is to revisit some of the main debates and main points of contention in the history of resistance to colonial settlement in both society, and to review some of the perspectives that were very important, viable, and vibrant throughout the 20th century, but have come to be neglected and misremembered and ignored in the course of the recent decades, with the focus on the immediate political relevance of such debate. So for me, the history is not just history. That's important in its own right, of course, but it's something that we need to revisit in order to understand why we ended up where we are today and where can we go from here. So what I am trying to do in the book is to study the resistance conceptualizations in both societies alongside each other and try to derive some comparisons, some lessons, some conclusions from the comparison. And the main conclusion for me is the South African struggle was a specific struggle motivated by the specific historical conditions of South Africa. Of course, every struggle is located in a specific context. And the main force that shaped this struggle is the need to overturn South African society from within, using the location of the mass of the indigenous population from within the social and economic structures of South African society into which they were forcibly incorporated in a subordinate position, to use their strategic position from within South African institutions and economic structures to transform the society. And in the process, also to make overtures to at least a segment of the settler population to take part in the struggle, both for practical reasons. It makes it much easier to overcome apartheid if you include a segment of the white population that turns against the regime from within its own ranks. And it's also a question of political values. It's not just the pragmatic aspect of that, but the vision of a unified society in which everyone is included on an equal basis as proclaimed in the Freedom Charter of 1955, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. That's the kind of guiding principle. That's a value, again, in its own right. It's not just about the pragmatics of the situation. It's a value to which the bulk of the liberation movement was committed and indeed managed to implement it in practice and to reach the transition of 1994 and the transformation of the society. Of course, we all know there are lots of remaining social, economic, political problems, but the basic transition from apartheid has been accomplished. The question of Palestine is a bit different, and that's something that I do want to draw a lesson from South Africa. And the main reason for the difference is that whereas the special type of colonialism implemented in South Africa, what the Communist Party calls colonialism of a special type, involved the forcible incorporation of indigenous people into economic and social structure, the colonialism of a special type in Israel Palestine involved the forcible exclusion of people, indigenous people, from social, economic, and political structure. As a result of which, much of the Palestinian struggle, since 1948 at least, has been conducted from outside the boundaries of the Israeli state in a physical sense, but also in a political and conceptual sense. And this is a very important difference because the choice by South African liberation movement of using their subordinate position within South African economic and social structure to political advantage, this choice is not available to all Palestinians. Only a minority of Palestinians occupy physically, socially, politically a similar position to Black South Africans. The bulk of them, I would say probably about 80% of Palestinians, are excluded physically to varying degrees from Israeli society and the political system and the geography, the geographical territory of Palestine, whether they live in the occupied territories, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and definitely if they live in exile in the diaspora outside of the boundaries of historical Palestine, they don't have that similar choice of overturning Israeli society from within, undermining the system of domination from within. And that leads to a very different circumstances in which they have to operate. So the South African case offers some useful lessons, but they cannot be implemented as is because of the different political circumstances in which Israeli and Palestinians live in and relate to each other.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was going to ask about the fact that you wrote in your book so articulately that in South Africa there was the forceful incorporation of indigenous people into a subordinate position in society, and that in Palestine there has been the forceful exclusion, and that has resulted in key differences in the way that resistance has been forged. So thank you for articulating that here. Jeff, in your book, you speak about the importance of a political program, not just thinking of human rights in relation to Israel-Palestine, but a political program. So I'd like to pose some of the questions, back to you that you pose in your book. What would decolonization entail? So how do we overcome Israeli opposition to a single egalitarian state, as well as the support Israel receives from global governments?
Well, that relates very much to what Ron was just saying. And that is that the Palestinians are in a much, I would say, more difficult situation than the Black African population in South Africa was, or the other populations that were fighting against apartheid, because as Ron says, there was this incorporation. So in 1955, in the Freedom Charter, the ANC could say, we are all South Africa. In other words, there was a South Africa, there was a state, there were civic institutions, there was a sense, despite apartheid, of this sense of incorporation or inclusiveness, and the struggle was to end the apartheid system and, in a sense, take over the state and transform the state into a democracy for all its citizens. You don't really have that here. And again, it's because I guess I'm trying to think about what Ron was saying. I don't know so much about the South African settler colonial movement of the British and the Dutch, but certainly in Zionism there was this idea of exclusivity and exclusion from the very beginning. In other words, the idea was this country belongs to us, Jews, exclusively. There is no other national group. There's no groups with national rights, with claims to the land, no collectivity. I mean, this famous Zionist slogan, it's a land without a people. I mean, they knew they were Arabs here, but they didn't add up to a collectivity with any kind of national or collective rights. And so not only were they excluded, but the whole idea was exclusion to the nth degree. In other words, to displace them. I mean, Israel ended up with, we have to actually, if you take the entire country that Zionism aspires to take, it doesn't want to take 78% of it. It wants to take the entire country, which it has done, basically. The Palestinians are still the majority population. So that one of the slogans you have in Israel is, we never finished 1948. One of the criticisms of Rabin, who was one of the major military figures of 48, was that he and Ben Gurion didn't finish the job. They didn't displace all the Arabs. And now we're stuck with this population. And now we have to exclude them, but at the same time, they're still within our framework, and that leads us to apartheid. And that expresses itself in the idea then that we can't do what South Africa did, because if we incorporate the Arabs in this country, as we call them, the Palestinians, then it's not a Jewish state. I think that's a major difference with South Africa. It maybe defined itself as white in a way, but not in the sense that the Jews are defining this exclusively as a Jewish state, and therefore Jews, non-Jews by definition, have to be excluded. And so you can't, even if you decolonize and you try to dismantle the structure of control and domination, you still don't get, certainly from an Israeli point of view, to a transformation. I think even the Palestinian, you can't, in other words, there is no, like, as the ANC said, we're all South Africans. We can't say that here. We're not all anything. There is no common state or civic framework that you can transform into a state of all its citizens. The very concept of Zionism eliminates that, and I don't think Palestinians have any illusions that if they do succeed in trying to get to some negotiations with Israel, that somehow they'll be able to transform the state like the ANC was able to do in South Africa. And so in a way, they're in a much more, because what we have to do here is we have to invent a new state, a state that doesn't exist. We can't take a South Africa with its institutions and repurpose them for the benefit of the entire population. We have to dismantle pretty much what exists, and we have to create a new state. We don't even have a name for the state. I mean, you could talk about South Africa. We can't talk about Palestine because that's not inclusive. It's not going to be Israel. We don't even have a common name. And not only that, but there is no common civic identity that unites Israelis and Palestinians, Israeli Jews and Palestinians. We have nothing in common, nothing to hold us together as you did in your way in South Africa. So here, I think this whole concept of decolonization, and not just decolonization, that might be the easier part. The part of what I call reassembling. Where do you go from there to create one state? It has to be a completely new state with a new name, a new civic identity, and a new political community, and new ways of relating to each other that people can't even imagine today, Israelis or Palestinians alike. And so in some ways, I think it's a much more difficult struggle than and more complex maybe than it was in South Africa.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, it's a difficult one. Ran, I'd also love to give you an opportunity to respond to that question of, maybe if you'd like to build on what Jeff has said, or agree or disagree or add, what aspects can we hope for? How can we decolonize? How can we dismantle the state and rebuild?
I agree with Jeff about the difficulty of the task. I want to add something about the lesson of history, not South African history, but Palestinian history, because Palestinians have raised a similar slogan to what in South Africa is known as non-racialism, the incorporation of all people on an equal basis, for the last 50 years or so. And that is the slogan of a secular democratic Palestine. But there is a reason this slogan has never been realized, has never moved beyond the slogan sort of stage into a political program that became viable and could potentially appeal to the Jewish population. And the reason is that in the initial conceptualization of secular democratic Palestine, and over the years, as it's been formulated in various variation by Fatah and the Popular Front and the Democratic Front and all the main Palestinian organizations, it's almost invariably has been formulated within the framework of broad-based Arab nationalism, and more specifically Palestinian Arab nationalism. So from the perspective of Israeli Jews, it was never genuinely inclusive because they regarded it as a nationalist, whether specific Palestinians or broad Arab nationalism attempt to incorporate them, but in a subordinate position. They were treated more as a religious group rather than as a national group, the way they define themselves. And that's something that we have to be clear about. the vast majority of Israeli Jews regard themselves not as an ethnic group, not as a racial group, not as a religious group, but as a national group. And their nationalism is very central to their identity. In the same way, nationalism was also the motivating force for Palestinians from the early beginnings of the national movement. Whether it was specific Palestinian nationalism limited to the territory of Palestine, it was always embedded within the broad Arab nationalist movement, which was kind of a cultural, ethnic type of movement that encompassed the majority of all of the Arab countries, much of the Middle East and North Africa. So within that context, and given that the Palestinian movement has always defined itself primarily in nationalist terms, and Israeli Jews have always regarded Israeli Jewish nationalism or broader Jewish identity defined in nationalist terms as the core element in their identity, it's very difficult today to conceive of any solution that would bypass nationalism, at least initially. And initially, I don't know how long that would take. It may take decades. But right now, I think, in my mind at least, there's no doubt that both groups, Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, regard their national identity as a core element of their being. And they would be very reluctant to give it up in any kind of political arrangement. That's why any solution that towards liberation, decolonization, emancipation, whatever you want to call it, has to recognize equality and justice, or to implement equality and justice for individuals, but also for collectives, because the collective identity, the collective thinking is still very much embedded in people's consciousness. So I don't see any realistic prospect, let's say in the next 2 decades at least, of overcoming this kind of core identity. And as a result, I think it would make more sense to speak about a bi-nationalist solution within the framework of a single state or two-state or two binational state, whatever. I don't want to talk about the administrative arrangements, but to regard both individual rights and collective rights as essential to any kind of solution in the future and any kind of post-colonial arrangement. Now, of course, when we talk about nationalism, we don't talk about necessarily a dominant, oppressive, expansionist type of nationalism. That's not acceptable because that disrupts any kind of chance for a solution based on equality, justice, and redress. But it's recognition that people operate beyond their individual interest in the framework of collective identity that they care deeply about. And as much as we would like to wish them away, we can't. So we have to operate through this conceptual framework in order to try to transform this type of nationalism from its dominant, domineering, expansionist form into something that is more cultural, ethnic in nature, that doesn't involve political power as an instrument for gaining privileges, but rather protecting the essential interest of each community.
Thank you. So this is also an opportunity for either of you to respond to the other, and to say that anyone who's online, please feel free again to pop questions into the Q&A box. We've got one question so far. Hopefully there'll be a few more coming through, but I'll give you a chance, Jeff, to respond.
Yeah, if I could do so briefly. I mean, it's true, there are two national groups here. I mean, there are other groups as well. There's 30,000 African asylum seekers here that are probably not going to leave. There's 100,000 what I call ethnic Russians that are Israeli citizens that aren't Jewish and don't want to be Jewish. And you have other groups here. You have Circassians, and you have Armenians, and I mean, there's a lot of other groups that aren't Palestinian per se or Israeli Jewish per se. So it's a multicultural country, but essentially we're talking about a conflict or a struggle between two national groups, and that's the basis. So in a sense, to relate to what Ron is saying, the easiest approach is to have a binational state. In other words, to say, we're not going. The civic identity is too weak and too abstract in a way to really have a political function, and therefore we simply have to have a state that incorporates. It's a binational state in which the two national groups find a way to work together. The problem with that, of course, is that that's a recipe for a civil war. In other words, if you don't have a civil kind of a structure that can constrain and contain those national impulses for hegemony and domination and eliminating the other or dominating the other national group, you're simply going to get into another struggle. And that's where this idea, as abstract as it is, of a civic state emerging is so important. And that's where we take a lot of encouragement actually from South Africa. I mean, we do look to South Africa for many lessons and so on. But one of the things is in South Africa now, it was true. It was easier because you already had a civic state and you had civic institutions, and I mean they were apartheid, but they were there, and you could imagine a South Africa without apartheid. You could imagine how you could transform these apartheid structures into non-racial structures and so on. That's hard for us to do here again. But I think that if we and that's what our One Democratic State campaign is trying to push ahead. If we begin to understand the importance of civil institutions and begin to build them now, we can begin to build a kind of a national, national in a civic sense consciousness. For example, if we engaged in a project of drafting a constitution, Palestinians and Israelis together in a very participatory kind of a way, and invite all kinds of groups in and generate that kind of discussion, that will really help people to imagine living together, to imagine how we could structure this, to bring up these issues. What we have to do that I think the ANC did between 1955 and 1994 was to really encourage a discussion, and not just a discussion, but really begin to build and present concrete alternative structures that people could really, in other words, people could see how it would work. You had a constitution before the end of apartheid. You had other documents and other, in other words, people could begin to imagine how it could work. Not that the whites agreed, but I think that's what allowed them to go through a transition. What we have to do is get to a stage where there's enough of a concrete kind of imagining of where we could go, a political program is what I've been talking about, not just in terms of decolonization, but a political program that includes the next stage, which is reassembly, which is building something new. If we can be detailed enough, and in fact kind of make it exciting and challenging for people, that we're now coming into a joint venture, let's build something together, and begin to use that kind of a language, I think that then we have a chance to begin to put the national groups within, like Ron was saying, within more of a cultural context. I mean, they'll have political space and they'll have self-determination to a degree. I call it sufficient sovereignty, but at the same time, they're constrained by a wider civic thing. So that's where I think I just don't think binationalism is an option, because I think it's an invitation to continued conflict, and we've got to begin to insert already a third alternative, which is a civic state.
Thank you. We're getting lots of questions into the chat. So Jeff, the first question was to you. So we'll pose it straight away. As a as as a Jew who fled Israel after 3 years in the IDF and a couple of other horrific experiences, what chances do you give to a realization of one state for all in the next 50 years?
I mean, I fled Israel. I'm sitting here in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure what. Look, I'm what I call in my book. The introduction to the book is a settler who refuses, or a colonist who refuses. I think, I came here, 50 years ago. This year it's 50 years. I've served my time. I'm ready for parole. I don't know if I want to flee, but it'd be nice to be liberated, maybe. But at any rate, I think and things changed. And then when I came here, it was a different situation. I had a different concept in mind. I was always on the left in the peace movement. I was never really a Zionist, but nevertheless, I became a part of Israeli society and so on. And my thinking has evolved over time until today. I would call myself an anti-Zionist, an anti-colonialist, and so on, that wants to go beyond Israel and transform it again into a wider civic entity. So I think it's not so much, but at the same time, I don't deny that there's a connection between the Jewish people in this country. I mean, isn't the colonial situation like, a Dutch reform guy gets up one morning in Holland and goes to South Africa in order to colonize. There was a genuine connection between Jews in this country, and so in the sense, I think that we can make the case that that Israeli Jews have a place to be here. They have a certain legitimacy. I mean, there's a mixture of settler colonialism, which is illegitimate, that you have to dismantle, but a sense of Jewish nationalism that I think was given the context of the rise of Zionism and so on, is understandable and was somewhat legitimate. And so in a sense, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so I think what the one state idea does by decolonizing and then making room for both national groups, and I agree with Ron, the Palestinians have got to see Israeli Jews as a national group that they resist. That's not their concept. And Israeli Jews have got to see Palestinians as a national group that they also resist. So there's a long way to go, but I think the idea of the political program is how do you, I won't say redeem the Zionism in a way, but how do you create a situation in which there is a place, and even a legitimate place? The whole idea of Zionism was to come home, whether that was an ideology or simply a narrative or sincere or not, but that was the concept. And I think decolonization and the creation of one state allows Israeli Jews to come home, not to dominate, but to have a cultural space, to have their narrative, to have their identity, and so on, but to be in a situation where they really become a part. In other words, they go beyond being settlers. There's an indigenization process where later generations in a post-colonial era can really become a part of this country and this region.
Thank you. The attendee actually clarified that it was them who they were talking about. So it wasn't, the question was posed to you, but they were talking about themselves fleeing. So yeah, sorry for the misunderstanding there. But maybe Rana can pose the next one to you from another attendee. Hello, how do you approach an American Jew, for example, who was born and raised in New York, but think they have the right to go and live in Israel with its current human rights abuse record?
It's very difficult to approach except by saying, no, you don't have the right to do that unless you get the consent of the people of the country. You don't have the right to go anywhere in the world without getting the consent of the people who already live there. Now, of course, you can say the majority of the population of Israel, or rather the majority of the citizens of Israel, agree that any Jew who wants to go and relocate to Israel has the right to do that. but they established their own right through the use of force against the opposition of the indigenous population. So it's very difficult to claim this kind of right for yourself if it involves undermining the rights of other people. So I would say, just ask yourself, not what is my right to do, but how, by taking this step, I am undermining, or what is the impact on other people who live there? Because your right, even if you believe you have a right, is not absolute. No right is ever absolute. And if the exercise of your right leads to the abolition, to the undermining, to the erasure of the rights of other people who are already there, then the answer, you have no moral justification in taking that step. So it's a simple principle, I guess, in moral philosophy. You have a right to do whatever you want as long as you don't impinge on the right of other people. And it's a very simple principle that we normally accept in our daily behavior. You don't have the right to go to our neighbor and break down the property. So why would you claim that right regardless of the response, the wishes, the concerns of the people who will be impacted upon by your steps? So it's just a basic request for considering the other, considering the impacts of your step, regardless of what you believe about your own rights.
Thank you. There's another question directed to you, Ran, to your point that, so I'm just reading it here. Ran, to your point that at least initially, we cannot imagine a just and democratic solution that bypasses nationalism. What is your view on recent efforts by some Jewish intellectuals like Peter Beinart to reframe Zionism in more culturalist terms, i.e. a Jewish home in Palestine, Israel, rather than a Jewish state? How does this square with settler colonial origins of Zionism?
Well, in a previous book called Zionism and Discontent, I have a very long chapter on the binationalist movement, the early binationalist movement of the 1920s to the 1940s, led by people like Martin Buber and Gershom Scholem and Yehuda Magnes and so on. Intellectuals, mostly of German origin, who did regard themselves as Zionists, but defined as Zionism not in a political sense, but in a cultural sense. And they called for the creation of a spiritual or cultural home for Jews without dominating the country, without oppressing the Palestinians. To some extent, their movement was also against Palestinian wishes because they immigrated and settled in the country against the wishes of the dominant Arab nationalist movement of the time. But their aims were much more modest, much more compatible with the rights of the indigenous population. And it was a very important consideration for them. Even when they called for Jewish immigration into Palestine, they agreed to limit it to the point that it doesn't overwhelm demographically the indigenous population. I think what Peter Beinart is doing is trying to revive this tradition. But the thing is that what was possible conceptually and even politically 100 years ago, I mean, that movement was created about 100 years ago and survived for about 20 years. So we're talking about a period of 80 to 100 years ago, may not be viable today because whatever possibility existed for Zionism back then, there are roads that were taken and not taken. There are choices that were made and not made. And as a result, by the 1950s at least, Zionism has consolidated into something that is focused on political domination, on ethnic exclusivity, on demographic exclusion, on ethnic cleansing. And that's something that is very difficult to undo. So theoretically, you still have these kind of options, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, to realize them under the name of Zionism. There is a room for Jewish identity, or can call it even Jewish national identity, that is focused on tradition, ethnicity, culture, language, religion, and so on. And that's my understanding of binationalism in a non-political sense. And I think it's viable and legitimate and should be encouraged. But I wouldn't call it Zionism, because once you remove the political element, what would make it a specifically Zionist type of movement, as opposed to just a Jewish cultural revival type of movement, which I would definitely support. And you have this kind of Jewish cultural revival movements in the US, in South Africa, in the UK, in various other countries. And it's a very progressive and positive development. But you have to remove the quest for political domination from it. And once you remove it, I think continuing to use the term Zionism with the tainted legacy with which it's been associated would be counterproductive. So I don't see any possible reason to retain that particular label in such a development.
Thank you. This one is directed to Jeff. So thanks to all who are writing into the chat. We've got lots of questions coming up. So to Jeff, why can't Jews live within a democratic, secular Palestinian state in relation to what you were saying earlier? Because you cannot live besides the settler colonial mentality, and the Oslo Accords proved just that.
Well, I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about before. We're talking about two national groups. And in a sense, what that question is reflecting is the way, I think, again, the Palestinians look at, there's different concepts of what one state means. And like I said before, the Palestinians' concept is one of liberation, total liberation. In other words, the idea is that, yes, Palestine, and there's no question about what the name of the country is. Palestine is Palestine. It becomes Palestine again. It's run by Palestinians. And if you then push the question, well, what happens to the Israelis? You don't get answers. There's a lot of resistance among Palestinians, I have to be honest, to really begin to deal with that issue. And understandably, given the history and what's even going on today. But that idea of total liberation, is really more of a classic colonial idea. When the Mau Mau and the Kenyan liberation movement began, or when liberation in other African countries or in Asia or whatever began, the colonists went home because they weren't settler colonists. They weren't there to, the British weren't in India to turn India into a part of Britain. They weren't going to incorporate it, and so they went home. Well, here you don't have that kind of a situation, and so the Israelis see themselves as a national group under the concept of total liberation of Palestinians. The idea, and even the idea of the secular democratic state that the PLO had, was again in this concept of total liberation. It's a Palestinian state, and the Jews can stay, but they stay as a religious minority. They don't get a designation as a national group. They don't get national rights. They're a religious ethnic group that within the country with equal civil rights, but in a way not equal national rights, because the country nationally belongs to the Palestinians. So that's where I think the this alternative idea of liberation that we're trying to talk about, and that is, again, like I said before, in settler colonialism, the settlers don't leave, and at the same time, Israelis do see themselves as a national group. They are not going to agree to be reduced to simply to a religious group or an ethnic group. And so that's, I think, something the Palestinians, we have to work on that, and there's resistance to it. But that has to be a basic part of the program. So the idea that Jews just continue to live here, but as Jews, and maybe with equal rights, but not really national rights and everything, isn't, I don't think, a workable idea.
So thinking about the future and how things will work in terms of a political program, etc., there's a question here about the right of return. Either of you can choose to answer it. So how would the right of return work practically?
Ron, you want to talk about that?
Look, I don't have any kind of magic formula how to implement it, and we're still very far from even formal principled recognition of the right of return. If you can think of one single idea that unifies all Israeli political parties, with the exception of the Palestinian-based political parties, all the way to Meretz and beyond it, is the opposition to the right of return. I would say, I don't know about specific figures, I can't quote from specific polls, but I would say that 90 to 95% of the Israeli Jewish population is totally opposed to it. So that's the starting point. We don't have even this recognition, okay, we acknowledge it, but we don't know how to implement it, maybe 50 years from now, not even that. Now, given that's the situation, I find it very complicated to start outlining under what circumstances it could be implemented. But what I would suggest when we think about it or imagine how it could be implemented, that it would have to be done in a gradual and staggered manner. So one thing that one could demand immediately, not that it would lead to any immediate steps in return, but it would open up the conversation, is to open up the gates to any one of the original 1948 refugees who are still alive, which is a very small percentage of the totality of the Palestinian refugee population, given that we are talking about an event that took place 75 years ago. We are talking about a population the size of maybe 1% of the total Israeli population. There may be about 50,000, 100,000 people who would still be eligible to return under the conditions of having been members of the original population of refugees from 75 years ago, and try to work around that. I mean, it's a very long process. It won't lead to any immediate steps, but as an educational tool, as a, I don't want to use the word propaganda, but as a tool in campaigning around the issue, it may be very powerful. You can look at a number of refugees who meet this criteria and say, how could these people who are of the ages of 75 to 90 or 100, how could they possibly pose any threat to the security of Israeli Jews? What could possibly happen that would undermine any of the foundation of Israeli society if to let these people spend the last years of their lives in their ancient homeland, the land not of their ancestors, but the land where they lived themselves until they were forcibly excluded from it. So again, I don't expect Israel to respond in any positive manner. They probably will call it demographic terrorism or whatever terms they will choose to attach to it. But as an educational strategy, as a mobilizing strategy, as a solidarity strategy, I think it could be very powerful. So I'm not saying that you should abandon the rights of all the other ones who don't meet this criteria of being the first generation, but start with them and then walk forward.
Can I say it? Can I
Yeah,
comment?
sure.
I have a different take on that, partly because we're part of a political movement. We developed a political program and we don't want to wait 20 years. There are processes, but I think there's an urgency here. And we've tried to think through, this is maybe one of the key issues, certainly. And we have a 10-point program that you could look up. We have a website called onestatecampaign.org, and we have our 10-point program. And on top almost is the right of return. You're not going to get anywhere without the right of return of all the refugees and their descendants. We're talking about 5 or 6 million, refugees, refugees and their descendants. Now, we took another leaf. We're taking another leaf, maybe, out of the South African playbook. I mean, South Africa, with all the real fundamental differences, there are things that I think we could take from South Africa. And one is, now, I'm not an expert on your struggle, so I might be representing this, and but this is the way we're sort of looking at it. In a way, the ANC faced the same issue that the Palestinians face here. And that is that the dominant white population of South Africa was not going to agree to dismantle apartheid. They weren't going to be partners in any proactive way. And what the ANC did, in my view, is they bypassed them. They basically, the ANC strategy, I mean, there was a military wing and there were economic sanctions. There were all kinds of things inside, I'm aware of, they were important. But one of their main strategies was to go to the international community. And not governments necessarily, because the governments weren't sympathetic to them, just like they're not sympathetic to the Palestinians, but to the civil society. They went to churches, they went to trade unions, they went to university groups, political organizations. In other words, everybody in the world of my age was involved in the anti-apartheid campaign. Everybody, I don't know almost anybody that wasn't, including Republicans. And that, I think, had a tremendous impact on changing government policies and, of course, the economic boycotts. When Ford Motor Company pulled out, when you had the sports boycotts and so on, when corporations did not want to be sullied by being associated with economic enterprises in apartheid South Africa, in other words, it all made apartheid unsustainable. Our job is to make Israeli apartheid and Israeli colonialism unsustainable. And in that way, we have, and this is the point I'm trying to make, we have to bypass the Israeli population. We can't ask them, we can't expect them to agree. They're not going to agree. Ron is absolutely right. 99% of Israelis would never allow refugees to return. Well, you can't deal with that. You have to simply bypass them, create a pincher movement in which you have resistance and struggle from inside. You have the equivalent of an anti-apartheid struggle from the outside, and you create conditions in which Israeli apartheid becomes unsustainable. And then in a sense, then you create a situation in which it's not up to the Israelis whether the refugees return or not. So that's one thing. Now, the refugee return itself, just in a sentence, is very possible. And it makes sense, the big revolution in our concept of one state is going from an ethno-national reality that Zionism has created in Israel to the idea of citizenship, and again, a civic state. Well, not only do refugees have the right of return, which they do, but in a way, there's a logic to citizenship. Just because they left the country in 48, and 67 as well, or were driven out of the country or fled the country, doesn't mean they lost their civil status. And so in a sense, giving them automatic citizenship is their incoming. They've never lost their citizenship. And now this new civil state has the ability to grant it to them and bring them home. And just one more quick thing, there's a Palestinian geographer named Salman Abu Sita, who's done a lot of work over the years on land issues in Palestine. And he's discovered that 85% of the land that was taken from the Palestinians in 1948 is still available. It was never built upon. Israel has basically built its urban and even agricultural communities on the basis of what was sort of developing from the turn of the 20th century. So a lot of 85% of the land that the Palestinians lost is still agricultural land, or it's national parks, or it's under forests, so that there's actually a physical possibility of refugees to return not to their homes. Israel demolished their villages and towns and urban areas, but to actually return to the areas in which they came from. And there's an Israeli organization called Zochrot that some of you might know that's preparing for the return of the refugees. And it's a whole, there are teams of young Palestinian urban planners and architects that have actually designed new cities to be built, or communities to be built on these lands in which the refugees are able to return to. So I think it's a very real possibility if our struggle succeeds. It can't be detached from the struggle, and I don't agree with Ram that it can be gradual either. It has to be upfront. The Palestinians will never participate in any struggle that doesn't recognize the right and the immediate return of all the refugees, and that's an issue that I think we've tried to struggle with in our political program.
If I may just have a quick comment on that. I think the unfortunate situation is that we simply cannot bypass the Israeli Jewish population. There is no solution, there is no political scenario in which any kind of arrangement, whether it's gradual or complete and immediate return of the refugees, can be imposed on the Israeli Jewish population against their will. Now, it would be great if we had this kind of massive international pressure combined with pressure from within to force the majority. But where would this pressure come from? And who has the power to exercise this pressure? So as a scenario, that a visionary scenario, it's wonderful. But as a practical political program, I don't see it's happening anytime soon.
But you did that in South Africa.
But in South Africa, if
you imposed the post-apartheid regime on a population that didn't want to by mobilizing the international grassroots.
Well, that's the issue that I discuss in my book, and a lot of other people discuss, of course. The international campaign against South Africa, the sanctions, the boycotts, only took off on a massive scale after South Africa became ungovernable through public protest and mobilization from within. It was not a substitute for internal mobilization. It only became possible as a result of internal mobilization and under its impact. It wasn't a product of the ANC on its own. The ANC didn't manage to do it from the 50s to the 1980s. It only managed to coordinate the pressure, the international pressure on South Africa to mobilize for it. Once the internal democratic movement, the trade unions, the student movements, the communities emerged as a powerful political force, once the townships started their rebellion, once South Africa became less attractive as an investment destination, only then did sanctions begin. And that's the one thing that is problematic in this conceptualization. It's a beautiful vision, but in the absence of first in terms of political priority and first in terms of trajectory of a massive popular mass mobilization from within, I believe there is no chance for international pressure from the outside, except for what exists today, which is not negligible, but it definitely doesn't have the dynamism, the capacity, the power to force Israeli society to make any concession. Look at the power of the boycott and sanction movement, even to force Israel to withdraw for one single settlement, or to put a curb to the activities of militant settlers, genocidal activity against Palestinians in the West Bank today. And then imagine putting this kind of pressure to undermine the most foundational principle of Israeli society that unites the Israeli Jewish population almost totally. So you need a massive exercise of pressure from the outside that would be possible theoretically, but only once we have a similar type of pressure from within. And that's for me the crucial strategic question that it's not for us to answer, but at least to pose. How do we generate this kind of massive pressure from within? How do Palestinians mobilize in order to exercise effective pressure from within on the occupation? How Israeli, Palestinian citizens of Israel mobilize in solidarity with Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and of course pursuing their own concerns, and how they manage to form alliances with Israeli Jews, not all Israeli Jews obviously, but at least a critical strategic minority that will make a powerful statement and a powerful political movement. Now, if we look at what's happening in Israel today, we see this kind of powerful pressure exercised from within by a very substantial section of the Israeli Jewish population, but with very limited aims. It doesn't include fighting the occupation. It includes fighting some corrupt practices of the ruling party and potentially as progressive political consequences. But this kind of force can be mobilized from within. So I wouldn't give up on it, both because I think it's a possible and realistic scenario that at some point in time, not immediately, Israeli Jews or some segments of the Israeli Jewish population will mobilize, but also because I don't see any possibility of change from without this force from within, because Israeli Jews may not have the power to impose their domination forever, but they do have the power to destroy any alternative if they feel cornered and threatened. So for me, it makes much more sense to try and focus our effort in mobilizing, in campaigning, in trying to influence the Israeli Jewish population from within, not to give up on them, even if the chances of making inroads that are substantial, that involve strategic sector within society, are quite slim and remote at the moment. But things change. And what we are seeing today is a potential for hope. It's not sufficient, it's not guaranteed, it's not enough, but it's a positive development, and we should build on it and try to develop it further.
So I'll be wrapping up soon so that we end on a high note. I know that there are lots and lots of questions. I hope that others can email both of you afterwards and engage further, but I'm just going to read out a comment and maybe can allow both of you to have a wrap-up opportunity. So an attendee wrote, "The transition from apartheid to a multinational South African state was possible because political transformation could happen alongside continued economic exclusion overwhelmingly in terms of identity. This was rooted in the paradoxical material interdependence and balance of forces between white and black South Africans in international context. White South Africa faced growing costs to apartheid. Given the differences discussed reoccupied Palestine, it seems only political struggle that shifts the terrain will enable transition to a new state that includes everyone in the count of the human. Political struggle by the Palestinian people and in the United States in particular." I hope you both heard that. Jeff, I'll give you a chance to respond and unfortunately to wrap up this great conversation.
All right. Well, first of all, we should end on a high note. Despite the terrible things that are happening, the struggle is alive, and I think our small group, the one which is a Palestinian-led organization, in a way, we've thought through a lot of these processes, from colonialism to decolonization to reassembly and so on. And we've come to the conclusion that it's doable. I mean, it isn't just some academic exercise. None of us are interested in just throwing out ideas as academics. We're all politically involved. There are two missing elements, and I'll relate to what Ron said, and this as well, and finish up. I think if I didn't think we could prevail and we could do what you guys did, and hopefully more successfully, because there were certain failures in decolonizing in South Africa that we shouldn't repeat here. The Chinese have a great saying, the second mouse gets the cheese. So hopefully we can learn, you guys were the first mouse, and we can maybe avoid some of the mistakes you made. But nevertheless, we feel that this is a real achievable political struggle. There's two missing elements here. One is that, you know, I think you have the mobilization internationally that you had in the anti-apartheid days. In other words, I think the Palestinian struggle has reached the global dimension of the anti-apartheid struggle. The problem is that you don't have a political program. In South Africa, there was always an end game. We knew we were boycotting South Africa for one person, one vote. Well, they didn't put it quite that politically correct in those days, but one person, one vote, that was the program. We don't have that today. I mean, it's unclear. Do we want one state, or what do the Palestinians even want? One state, two states, confederation, total liberation. I mean, everybody's talking with a different voice. And that disempowers all of you, because you can't advocate for a political program because there isn't any agreed upon political program. So if you go before your members of parliament or your government and they say, well, okay, what do you want? All you can say is, you know, BDS and end the occupation, and, you know, and that's really what's disempowering and disabling us. So that if a political program like the one we're not suggesting ours is the program, but it's a thought through process that we can build on, that would then empower you. Now, what that means is we have to get a critical mass of Palestinians to buy in. And that's what's really hard. That's where their struggle is so much harder than your struggle was, because they've been fragmented. There are 5 or 6 different or many more different Palestinian communities, you know, inside Israel, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in the different refugee camps, in the diaspora, you know, that aren't in contact with each other anymore. Each one's living in a different environment with a different set of circumstances and agendas and needs of survival. There's no more PLO. Arafat and Abu Mazen dismantled the PLO 30 years ago, so there's no uniting liberation organization. And these are the tremendous obstacles that the Palestinians have to overcome before they can unite to some degree behind a political program that then they can say to you, all right, this is the program that we want you to advocate for, which would empower you. If that all happens, I think the struggle is very doable, no less so than your struggle was. But it's going to take, it's true, it's going to take much more time and effort for us to get to that level than it took for you, because you had a, you know, as Ron was saying, you had a kind of a united, to some degree, the people were inside. I mean, the Black African population in particular was inside for the most part, and it was an internal struggle. You don't have that here really, because there isn't an inside. You know, everybody's in and they're out, and some are completely out and they're not in contact with each other, and there's a lack of leadership. So all those are the two things that we're working on. You know, or the Palestinians are working on, and there are efforts in that direction of reviving the PLO, of having new elections for the Palestinian National Council, the PNC. I mean, the Palestinians are aware of this. There's young Palestinians in the world that are part of what's called the PYN, the Palestinian Youth Network, that are creating. They're trying to build that. But at the same time, I think we have to really push them and encourage them to begin to move more quickly towards a political program that then we can empower you to advocate for in the future. So if those elements are in place, and I'm not minimizing the difficulties of getting them in place, I think this struggle is imminently doable. And that's the high note.
Thank you. Ran, if you want to wrap up your points as well.
Well, I don't want to give sort of advice on what people need to do. People have to decide for themselves. But what I can say is what from my point of view, needs to happen in order for the struggle to become successful. And I agree with Jeff about the central importance of unity. As long as the camp, however broadly defined or narrowly defined, of opposition to Israeli practices of colonization, both historical colonization and current colonization, as long as this camp is fragmented and divided, it cannot possibly succeed. And further, it cannot possibly attract the necessary international solidarity and support that is also an essential ingredient in the success of the struggle. So what kind of unity do we need to achieve or needs to be achieved in order to make the struggle successful? And I will just point here that unity in South Africa was never complete. And to the extent that there was a more unified campaign under a central slogan, it was a product of very hard political work of decades. It's not something that was given. And the ANC was just one force among others that did manage eventually to achieve sort of hegemony in the liberation movement, but it was not guaranteed and it wasn't always the case. And we need to learn, and I write about it in the book. I don't want to repeat myself or to elaborate too much about it. But one of the central things, well, two central things that made the ANC successful in relation to other oppositional movements like Black consciousness, Pan-Africanism, and so on. First, the inclusive vision that incorporate potentially everyone in the struggle against the regime. So not insisting on narrow nationalist, ethnic, religious, tribal type of identity. That's one element. And the second element, which I think was to some extent imposed on the ANC from the outside, but it adopted it and ran with it, was the need to combine political nationalist concerns with social justice issues, and the central role of the labor movement and the trade unions in the political struggle. And this combination of social concern or struggle on social issues that concern people in their daily lives, jobs, salaries, working conditions, housing, social services, together with political demands, made the ANC the powerful force that it became in the 1980s, but it wasn't really until then. Until then, it was much more limited in its impact and more susceptible to challenges from other directions. So this combination of political and the social and this unifying element were central to establishing this kind of unified movement. And the unifying element was also facilitated by two factors that don't exist in Israel Palestine. And so we need to find some kind of substitute for them. The role of religion that we haven't spoken about. In Israel, religion is a dividing force. In South Africa, it was unifying force because Christianity is potentially a unifying force at the vast majority of the population. Of course, there are non-Christians as well, but Christianity was a much more open type of religion as compared to Judaism, of course, which is exclusionary in nature, and to Islam to a lesser extent. And also the cultural dimension. English is a unifying language, is very important. English is not an imposition, it's not a white imposition in the same way that Hebrew is a Jewish Israeli imposition in the Palestinian context. So there were unifying elements in South African society that don't exist in the case of Palestine. But what can we do then, even that's the situation? I think in order for the struggle to be successful, we need to overcome the fragmentation and division. First of all, fragmentation and division within the ranks of the Palestinian movement itself. The situation in which you have opposing political leadership in the West Bank and Gaza that try to undermine each other and frequently engage in either open or tacit alliance with the Israeli regime in order to undermine its rival, I'm talking about the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, is obviously unacceptable. It undermines the struggle before it even begins. So that's something that every Palestinian is conscious of the need to overcome, but in practice, it hasn't happened. It's actually increasing the division. So Palestinians, without internal political unity, cannot really advance the struggle. Then there is the question of not so much political divisions, but more geographical, historical legacies of the refugees outside of the boundaries of historical Palestine, of the Palestinians under occupation since 1967, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are a minority of the overall Palestinian population, but they are very crucial strategically because they are the only ones who are not only within the territory, but they have certain amount of political power, and the only ones who can bring together not only Palestinians as a group, but also Palestinians and Israeli Jews, because they are sort of located in between. They don't have enough rights in order to identify with the Israeli regime, but they are not so totally excluded that they cannot still operate within the system and take advantage of the limited political rights and freedoms for which they enjoy. So we need unity between Palestinians in the different location of their existence. And of course, alliances across what in South Africa is known as the color line. It's not really a term applicable to Israel and Palestine, but whatever you call that line, along the national dividing line between progressive Israeli Jews. You will never get the majority of the Israeli Jewish population, but there are significant groups within it that can be mobilized for a progressive struggle, and the Palestinian movement itself. So you need internal unity, you need external unity, and only on the basis of that kind of unity, which is achievable if people overcome their petty political interest. I don't have any kind of formula how to convince people that petty political power within structures of domination is not really worth it, but that's where the struggle should focus, on mobilizing people from below in order to force those from above to change their practices and to unify against the challenge that faces all of them, and that is the practices of colonization, oppression, and domination that are exercised, carried out by the Israeli regime today more than ever. And because precisely, and I think today we are at a crucial turning point, because Israel has the most right-wing, the most oppressive, the most reviled government in its history, and that's saying a lot. And it's subject to a lot of internal resistance right now, today, even as we speak, as never before. There's never been massive refusal by Israeli Jews to serve in the military as there is today. There's always been a campaign to do that, but now we are talking about potentially tens of thousands of people, mostly men, who refuse to serve in the military reserves if the government continues on its course of action. Again, they don't do it for the sake of Palestinians, but it's an opportunity because it's a fundamental break with the existing practices of domination that can be taken advantage of in order to draw a wedge between the potentially progressive population and the utterly reactionary, which is hopeless to even try to do anything without it. And because the Israeli regime is also reviled internationally and is subject at least to verbal condemnation. There are no actual steps yet, not significant ones, but potentially it's very vulnerable at this point in time. So we are at a potentially positive turning point. Of course, it may all come to nothing, but potentially, and that's the kind of more positive finishing touch to this discussion, potentially we are at a point where change is possible. It's even likely, provided we take the initiative and move in the right direction.
On that note, thank you both so much for your contributions, your provocations, your discussions this evening. I just want to read out the names of your books again for everyone who is here. So Ran's book is Anti-Colonial Resistance in South Africa and Israel Palestine, Identity, Nationalism, and Race. And Jeff's recent book is Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. So thanks again for everyone who attended. Thanks to you both. And may we see a future that is egalitarian soon in our lifetimes.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much for organizing it.
Thank you.
Maybe you can say something about where can people find the recording when it's done?
Yes. So